They told Eleanor Grace that her father died of a broken heart. They lied. In the unforgiving heat of Wyoming, hearts don't break. They stop beating because someone pulls a trigger. When Eleanor stepped off that train in 1885, she thought she was inheriting a legacy. Instead, she inherited a grave, a mountain of debt, and a target on her back. She was a city girl with soft hands, and no idea that the man watching her from the shadows, a silent, scarred cowboy with a reputation for violence, was the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the truth about what happened at Blackwood Creek. The Union Pacific train screeched to a halt, exhaling a cloud of steam that smelled of coal and iron. For Eleanor Grace, that smell was the first warning that her life in Boston was truly over. She stepped onto the wooden platform of Blackwood Creek, Wyoming, clutching a carpet bag that contained everything she owned: 3 modest dresses, a Bible, and a letter from a lawyer named Amos Reed, telling her that her father, Thomas Grace, was dead. The wind hit her first. It wasn't a breeze. It was a physical assault carrying the grit of the high plains. Ellie adjusted her hat, feeling the eyes of the locals on her. They were hardened men and women, their skin like cured leather, staring at the woman in the pressed blue silk, who clearly didn't belong. "Miss Grace." The voice was oily. Ellie turned to find a man in a pinstripe suit that had seen better days. He was sweating profusely, despite the dry heat. "Mr. Reed?" Ellie asked. "The same. My condolences truly," Reed said, though his eyes darted nervously toward the saloon across the street. "We need to go over the particulars. The estate is complicated." They met in his cramped office above the general store. The particulars were worse than complicated. They were catastrophic. Thomas Grace hadn't just died. He had died owing money to half the territory. "The farm. The Grace homestead is technically yours," Reed explained, wiping his forehead with a stained handkerchief. "But there is a lien against the property. Your father borrowed $400 from Jedediah Sterling 3 years ago to buy cattle. The cattle died in the blizzard of '83. The debt remains." Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. $400, I don't have that kind of money." "Sterling is a reasonable man," Reed lied. Ellie could hear the tremor in his voice. "He's willing to buy the deed from you. It would cover the debt and give you enough for a ticket back east. And if I don't sell—" Reed stopped wiping his face. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Miss Grace women do not run ranches in Blackwood Creek alone, especially not next to the Sterling Range. Your father, he was stubborn. Look where it got him." Ellie stood up, her knees shaking but her jaw set. "Take me to the farm." The ride out to the homestead was silent. The buckboard wagon rattled over the hard-packed earth. As they crested a ridge, Reed pointed a trembling finger. "There it is." It was a skeleton of a place. The main house was grey and weathering, the porch sagging like a broken lip. The barn roof had partially collapsed. But the land was breathtaking. Rolling hills of sagebrush and wild rye framed by the jagged teeth of the granite mountains. But as they approached the gate, Ellie saw him. He was sitting on a black gelding on the other side of the property line watching them. He wore a duster coat faded almost white by the sun, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He sat with a stillness that was unnatural, like a predator waiting for the wind to shift. "Who is that?" Ellie asked. Reed whipped the horses faster, clearly anxious to get inside the house. That's Silas Thorne. Lives on the ridge. Don't go near him, Miss Grace." Why is he a criminal? He's worse, Reed muttered. He's a ghost, served in the Civil War, then the Indian Wars. They say he hasn't spoken a full sentence to a living soul in 5 years. And he hated your father. Ellie looked back as they pulled into the yard. Silas Thorne hadn't moved. He was just a silhouette against the blinding sun, watching her inherit a kingdom of dirt. The house was worse inside. Dust coated every surface like snow. Dirty dishes were still stacked in the basin, crusted with mold. It smelled of stale whiskey and sickness. Ellie walked into the study, her father's sanctuary. Papers were strewn everywhere. She picked up a heavy ledger from the desk. It fell open to the last entry, dated 2 weeks ago. The handwriting was shaky, different from her father's usual neat script. Sterling made the offer again. Told him I'd burn this house down before I let him take the water rights. Thorne was watching from the ridge today. I don't know whose side he's on anymore. If I die, it wasn't the drink. Ellie ran her thumb over the ink. Tears pricked her eyes, but she swallowed them down. She walked to the window. Silas Thorne was gone. That first night was terrifying. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, sounding like human screams. Ellie slept with a heavy cast-iron skillet next to her bed, the only weapon she could find. Around midnight she heard it. The sound of hooves. Heavy, deliberate. She crept to the window. Outside in the moonlight, a rider was circling the house. It was the man from the ridge. Silas. He wasn't attacking, though. He was patrolling. He rode a slow circle around the perimeter of the yard, stopped at the gate, and sat there for an hour, his rifle resting across his saddle. Ellie watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Was he keeping her in, or keeping something else out? 3 days. That was how long it took for Ellie to realize that the accident of her inheriting the farm was a calculated siege. The well pump handle had been smashed before she arrived. The fence along the southern border, the one bordering Jedediah Sterling's massive double-bar ranch, had been cut, allowing Sterling's cattle to graze on the only patch of green grass Ellie had left. She was in the yard, struggling to nail a slat of wood over a broken window, when she heard the thunder of horses. A group of 5 men rode into the yard. They didn't look like ranch hands. They looked like hired guns. In the center, on a massive white stallion, sat a man with a thick grey mustache and eyes like flint. Jedediah Bull Sterling. "Miss Grace," Sterling boomed, not bothering to dismount. "Amos Reed tells me you're being stubborn." Ellie gripped the hammer in her hand, wishing it was a Winchester. "Mr. Reed talks too much, and you're trespassing Mr. Sterling." Sterling laughed, a dry barking sound. "Trespassing, darling, your fence is down. My cows are already eating your grass. By the law of the range that makes it common land until you fix it. And looking at you," he looked her up and down with a sneer, "you couldn't fix a sandwich, let alone a 4-mile fence line." "I have the deed," Ellie said, her voice shaking but loud. "You have a piece of paper," Sterling spat. "I have the water, I have the money, and I have the patience. I'm offering you $200 now. The price goes down $10 every day you stay." He signaled to one of his men, a scarred thug named Kruger. "Help the lady understand the reality of her situation." Kruger grinned and unholstered a lasso. With a flick of his wrist, he didn't rope Ellie, he roped the porch support pillar next to her. He spurred his horse backward. Crack! The pillar gave way, and a section of the porch roof collapsed, missing Ellie by inches. Dust and shingles rained down on her. She fell back, coughing, the hammer flying from her hand. "Oops," Sterling said flatly. "Structural damage. Value just went down. Let's ride, boys." They galloped off, leaving Ellie in the wreckage bruised and humiliated. She spent the next 4 hours trying to clear the debris. Her hands, used to embroidery and piano keys, were blistered and bleeding. She was hungry, thirsty, and fueled only by a rage she didn't know she possessed. She grabbed a pair of wire cutters and a heavy spool of barbed wire she found in the barn. She was going to fix the southern fence. It was a fool's errand. The roll of wire weighed 80 pounds. She had to drag it a mile to the break. By the time she got there, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and red. Sterling's cattle were there, chewing placidly on her grass. Ellie yelled at them, waving her arms, but they ignored her. She tried to string the wire, but she didn't have the strength to pull it taut. The barbs tore at her dress and sliced her palm. She sat in the dirt, clutching her bleeding hand, and finally she broke. She put her head on her knees and sobbed. The isolation was absolute. She was going to die here, just like her father. A shadow fell over her. Ellie gasped and looked up. Silas Thorne was standing there. Up close, he was terrifying. He was huge, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained his linen shirt. A jagged white scar ran from his left ear down to his jawline, disappearing into his beard. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools. He held a pair of heavy leather gloves in one hand. "Get away from me," Ellie stammered, scrambling backward. "Reed said you hated my father." Silas didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He dropped the leather gloves in her lap. Then he turned to the fence. With a strength that seemed impossible, he grabbed the loose end of the barbed wire. He didn't use a stretcher tool. He wrapped the wire around his gloved forearm and pulled. The wooden post groaned. The wire sang as it snapped taut. In 10 minutes, Silas did what would have taken Ellie a week. He repaired the break, weaving the wire with expert precision. He shouted once, a guttural harsh sound, and waved his hat, sending Sterling's cattle stampeding back onto their own side of the line. When he was done, he walked back to Ellie. She was still sitting on the ground, clutching the gloves he had given her. He reached into his duster pocket and pulled out a small tin. He crouched down, invading her space, but his movements were surprisingly gentle. He gestured for her hand. Ellie hesitated, then offered her bleeding palm. Silas opened the tin. It was a pungent herbal salve. He applied it to the cut. The stinging stopped almost instantly. "Why?" Ellie whispered. "Why help me?" Silas looked at her. For the first time, she saw something behind the stoic mask. Pain. Ancient, deep-rooted pain. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, yellowed at the edges. He pressed it into her hand, then stood up, towering over her. He tapped the paper, then pointed toward the Sterling ranch, then drew a finger across his throat. The message was clear. "Sterling is going to kill you." "Wait!" Ellie cried as he turned to his horse. "You can speak. I know you can." Reed said. Silas paused. He looked back over his shoulder. His voice, when it came, sounded like grinding stones rusty from disuse. "Reed is a snake." He mounted his horse and rode into the twilight. Ellie looked down at the paper he had given her. It wasn't a note. It was a receipt. Received from Thomas Grace $5,000 for safekeeping, to be held in trust for Eleanor Grace. Date, January 1884. Ellie's breath hitched. $5,000. That was a fortune. Her father hadn't died in debt. He had died rich. But the money was missing, and the only person who knew about it was the silent man who lived on the ridge and the man who had just torn down her porch. She wasn't just fighting for a dying farm anymore. She was fighting for a stolen inheritance. And Silas Thorne wasn't just a neighbor. He was the vault. The morning sun didn't rise. It bled into the sky, promising a heat that would bake the resolve right out of a person. Ellie woke with her hand throbbing. The cut across her palm was angry and red, but the salve Silas had given her had drawn out the worst of the heat. She sat at the kitchen table, the heavy iron stove cold beside her, staring at the crumpled receipt Silas had pressed into her hand. $5,000. It was enough to pay off the lien 10 times over. It was enough to rebuild the barn, buy a new herd, and hire hands. It was freedom. But where was it? Ellie dressed in her most severe walking suit, a dark grey wool that was entirely unsuited for Wyoming in July, and hitched the buckboard. She was going to town. She wasn't asking Amos Reed for answers. She was going to demand them. The town of Blackwood Creek was waking up. Shopkeepers swept dust from their stoops into the dirt street, only for the wind to blow it right back. When Ellie walked into Reed's office above the general store, the lawyer was nursing a cup of coffee that smelled strongly of rye whiskey. He jumped when the door slammed shut. "Miss Grace, you're still here." He adjusted his spectacles, his eyes darting to the window as if expecting Sterling's men to be right behind her. "I'm not leaving Mr. Reed," Ellie said, her voice low and steady. She pulled the receipt from her reticule and slammed it onto his desk. "Explain this." Reed looked down. His face, usually flushed, went the color of curdled milk. He picked up the paper with trembling fingers. Where did you get this?" "My father left it. It says $5,000 was entrusted to you, or to the estate." "Where is the money?" "Amos," Reed laughed, but it was a brittle, frantic sound. He crumpled the paper in his fist. This is scribbling, Miss Grace. Your father was unwell." Towards the end, the whiskey ate his mind. He hallucinated fortunes that didn't exist. He wrote receipts for gold bullion he claimed was buried in the cellar. It's nonsense. "It's dated January," Ellie countered, leaning over the desk. "He was sober in January. I have his letters from that month. His handwriting matches." Reed stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over. "It is not admissible. There is no money in the bank accounts. There is no cash in the safe. If Thomas had $5,000, do you think he would have let the farm rot? Do you think he would have let Sterling humiliate him?" He leaned in his breath, sour. "Burn this paper, Miss Grace. If Sterling hears you're running around claiming to have a fortune, he won't just cut your fences. He'll think you're holding out on him. He'll come for you, and this time he won't use a lasso." Ellie snatched the paper back. "You're lying, and I'm going to prove it." She walked out, her heart hammering. Reed was terrified. That meant the money was real, but he didn't have it. If he had stolen it, he would have fled town by now. Someone else had it, or knew where it was. The ride back to the homestead was grueling. The heat had spiked to near 100 degrees. The horses were lathered and blowing hard. Ellie decided to detour to the creek that ran through the north pasture to let them drink. But when she reached the bank, she stopped. The creek bed was a ribbon of cracked mud. There were only stagnant puddles left swarming with mosquitoes. "No," Ellie whispered. "No, no, no." This creek was the lifeblood of the farm. Without it, the few cattle she had left would die within days. She looked upstream. The water flowed down from the mountains, passing through the narrow canyon on Sterling's land. She didn't think. She just rode. She urged the horses up the incline, following the dry bed toward the property line. A mile up, where the canyon narrowed, she found it. It was a dam. Not a natural rock fall, but a deliberate construction of logs and sandbags completely blocking the flow. Behind it, a reservoir of cool, clear water was building up, diverted into a newly dug irrigation ditch that led straight to Sterling's alfalfa fields. Ellie stared at the theft. It was a death sentence for her farm. "Hey there, little lady." Ellie spun around. Sitting on a rock ledge above her, whittling a stick, was Kruger, the man who had pulled down her porch. 2 other hands were with him, grinning wolfishly. "You're on double-bar land," Kruger said, sliding down the rocks. He still held the knife. "You stole my water," Ellie said, her voice trembling with rage. "This is illegal. Water rights are deeded." "Water belongs to the man who can hold it," Kruger sneered. He stepped closer. The other 2 men fanned out, cutting off her path to the wagon. "And you're a long way from home. No silent guardian angel here to help you today." Kruger reached out and grabbed the bridle of her horse. "Maybe we teach you a lesson about trespassing. Maybe you pay the toll." Ellie reached for the whip in the holder, but Kruger caught her wrist. His grip was bruising. "Feisty. I like that." Click. The sound was small, but in the canyon echo, it sounded like a cannon shot. Kruger froze. He looked up toward the canyon rim. Silas Thorne was there. He was lying prone on the ridge 500 feet up. The sun glinted off the long brass barrel of a Sharps buffalo rifle. He wasn't aiming at the sky. He was aiming directly at Kruger's chest. "Let her go," came a voice. It wasn't Silas. Ellie looked around wildly. Silas hadn't spoken. He had simply chambered a round. The threat was absolute. Kruger released her wrist slowly, holding his hands up. "Just having a conversation, Thorne. No need to get twitchy." He backed away. His eyes locked on the ridge. "You're making a mistake siding with her, Thorne. Sterling's gonna burn you out too." Kruger whistled to his men, and they mounted their horses, retreating back toward the Sterling ranch. Ellie let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 10 minutes. She looked up at the ridge. Silas stood up slowly, shouldered his rifle, and disappeared behind the rocks. He didn't come down. He didn't offer comfort. He just watched. Ellie drove the wagon back to her farmhouse, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. When she got into the kitchen, she collapsed into a chair. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. Ellie grabbed the skillet again, terrified it was Kruger coming back. She opened the door. No one was there. But on the porch there were 4 large wooden barrels filled to the brim with fresh water. Beside them was a heavy iron pry bar, a tool specifically designed for dismantling logs, and a note written in charcoal on a scrap of bark. "Tonight, moonset. We break the dam." They worked in the dark under the cover of a moonless sky. Ellie had never done manual labor like this in her life. The mud was heavy, sucking at her boots. The logs were slick and jagged. But Silas moved like a machine. He was in the water up to his waist, prying the heavy timber logs loose with the iron bar, his breath hissing through his teeth with the effort. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Ellie hauled the sandbags away as Silas freed them, dragging them onto the bank. Around 300 a.m., the structure gave way. With a low roar, the water burst through the breach, rushing back into its ancient channel, heading down toward Ellie's farm. Silas climbed onto the bank, dripping wet, his chest heaving. He looked at Ellie. She was covered in mud, her hair plastered to her face, her silk dress ruined beyond repair. For the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. He offered her a canteen. She drank the water sweet and cold. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas nodded. He pointed to her, then to the east, where the sky was lightening. "Go home, before they see." The next 2 days were a deceptive calm. The water was back in the creek, the cattle were drinking, and the farm felt for a moment like it might survive. Ellie spent the time searching the house. If Reed didn't have the money, and her father hadn't spent it, it had to be somewhere. She tore apart the library. She checked inside the hollow bedposts. She tapped every floorboard. She found nothing but dust and memories. On the third night, the wind picked up. It was a dry, hot wind coming off the desert, a devil's breath. Ellie was asleep when the smell hit her. It wasn't the sweet smell of sage. It was acrid, burning pine. She bolted awake, grabbing her robe. Through the window, the night was lit up in terrifying orange. "The barn!" she screamed. She ran outside, barefoot. The old barn, dry as kindling, was fully engulfed. The flames were licking 50 feet into the air, roaring like a freight train. "The horses!" She ran toward the inferno. The heat pushed her back like a physical hand. She could hear the horses screaming inside. She grabbed a blanket from the clothesline, dipped it in the horse trough, and threw it over her head. She was going in. Suddenly, a massive arm wrapped around her waist and hauled her back. It was Silas. He had abandoned his horse at the gate and sprinted across the yard. "Let me go! They're inside!" Ellie screamed, fighting him. "No!" Silas's voice was a ragged bark. Too late. He dragged her back toward the house, just as the barn roof collapsed with a thunderous crash. Sparks showered down on them like deadly rain. Ellie fell to her knees in the dirt, watching her livelihood burn. The wagon, the harness, the 2 plow horses, everything she needed to work the land was gone. But Silas wasn't watching the fire. He was watching the dark perimeter of the fields. He pulled his revolver, a heavy Colt Dragoon, and fired 2 shots into the darkness. Ellie saw muzzle flashes return fire from the tree line. Whiz! Thud! A bullet slammed into the dirt, inches from her knee. "Inside!" Silas roared. He grabbed her and shoved her through the back door of the farmhouse, kicking it shut behind them. He shoved a heavy oak table against the door. "Get down!" he commanded. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. The fire outside cast dancing shadows across the room, illuminating his face. He looked demonic, soot-stained, scarred eyes, wild with adrenaline. "Who are they?" Ellie asked, huddled on the floor. "Sterling's hired guns," Silas rasped. He sounded like he was swallowing glass. "They didn't just light the fire. They're here to finish it." "Why?" Ellie cried. "It's just land. Why kill for it?" Silas turned to her. The firelight caught the jagged scar on his neck. "Not just land." He forced the words out. He tapped his chest. "Gold." Ellie stared at him. "Gold." Silas slid down the wall to sit beside her, keeping his gun trained on the window. The roar of the fire outside was deafening, but in Hull the air was heavy with secrets. "Sterling thinks your father found the lost Dutchman vein," Silas said. His voice was getting weaker, the strain of speaking clearly painful. "Years ago, before the cattle." "My father was a farmer, not a prospector," Ellie said. He was a gambler, Silas corrected. He took a deep breath. He won the map. From me. Ellie's eyes widened. You. Silas nodded. He touched the scar on his neck. Sterling wanted the map. He sent men. 5 years ago. They cut my throat, left me for dead, took my voice. He looked at Ellie with an intensity that burned hotter than the barn. Your father found me, sewed me up, saved my life. I gave him the map to hide it, to keep it safe from Sterling. The receipt, Ellie realized. The $5,000. Fake, Silas whispered. A decoy. To make Reed look for money, not the map. Then where is the map? Ellie asked. Silas looked at the burning barn, then back at Ellie. He reached out and took her hand, turning it over to reveal the callus she had developed over the last week. He didn't trust paper, Silas said. Paper burns. He reached into his boot and pulled out a knife. Ellie flinched, but he reversed the handle and handed it to her. The mantle, he said, pointing to the fireplace in the parlor. The center stone. It's hollow. Outside, the shooting stopped. The silence was worse than the gunfire. It meant they were moving closer. They are coming, Silas said, standing up and checking the cylinder of his revolver. He had only 4 shots left. Get the map. I will hold the door. I'm not leaving you, Ellie said, standing up. You have to. Silas looked at her, and for a second, the warrior mask slipped. He looked tired. He looked lonely. You are the legacy, Ellie. I am just the ghost. He turned back to the window, leveling the gun. Go. Ellie ran to the fireplace. She gripped the knife and jammed it into the mortar around the center stone. It crumbled easily. It was fresh clay painted to look like old mortar. She pried the stone loose. Behind it was a small metal box. She grabbed it. It was heavy. Suddenly, glass shattered in the kitchen. Silas! A shot rang out inside the house. Ellie clutched the box to her chest and ran back toward the kitchen, ignoring Silas's order. She found him struggling with a man who had climbed through the window. It was Kruger. Kruger had a knife. He slashed at Silas, cutting his arm. Silas weakened by the smoke, and his old injuries stumbled back. Kruger grinned, raising the knife for a killing blow. Ellie didn't think. She swung the heavy metal box with all her strength. Clang! The corner of the metal box connected with the back of Kruger's head. He folded like a cheap suit, hitting the floor, unconscious. Silas stared at the man on the floor, then at Ellie. He was bleeding from his arm, breathing hard. You, he wheezed, a look of genuine shock in his dark eyes. You stayed. I told you. Ellie said, her voice trembling but fierce. I'm not leaving. She walked over to him and tore a strip from her nightgown, binding his bleeding arm. We're partners now, Silas Thorne, she said, tying the knot tight. And we're going to burn Jedediah Sterling to the ground. Silas looked at the bandage, then up at her. He nodded once. A pact sealed in blood and ash. Outside, the roof of the barn finally collapsed into embers. The attackers, seeing their leader Kruger didn't return, had pulled back into the shadows. But the war had just begun. The kitchen was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the unconscious man on the floor and the distant dying crackle of the barn. The air was thick with the smell of burnt pine and copper blood. Ellie knelt beside Silas, her hands steady as she tightened the bandage on his forearm. The cut was deep, a nasty slice from Kruger's Bowie knife, but it had missed the artery. Silas watched her, his dark eyes tracking every movement of her fingers. For a man who had lived like a feral ghost for 5 years, being tended to seem to confuse him. "You have good hands," he rasped the words, scraping out of his damaged throat. Ellie looked up, meeting his gaze. "They used to play Chopin. Now they stitch wounds." She tied off the cloth and stood up. She looked down at Kruger. The hired gun was breathing shallowly, a growing lump on the back of his head. "What do we do with him?" Silas stood, favoring his left side. He walked over to Kruger, grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him effortlessly across the floor. He pulled him out onto the porch and propped him up against the railing, facing the smoking ruins of the barn. Silas used the rope from the laundry line to bind Kruger's hands and feet to the railing. "We leave him," Silas said. "A message." "A message that we are not running away," Silas said. "We are hunting." They went back inside. The metal box sat on the table. It was a simple lock box, rusted at the corners. Ellie picked up the knife she had used to pry the stone loose and jammed the tip into the lock mechanism. With a sharp twist, the lock snapped. She opened the lid. There was no gold inside, no stacks of cash, just a single piece of cured leather wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the damp. Ellie unfolded it. It was a map drawn in black ink that had faded to grey. It didn't show the whole territory. It showed a specific range of the granite mountains, focusing on a jagged formation that looked like a split tooth. "The Devil's Anvil," Ellie whispered. She recognized the peak from the view out her bedroom window. It was 20 miles north, in the roughest, most snake-infested badlands in the county. Silas traced a line on the leather with a calloused finger. The line went up a dry wash through a narrow slot canyon and ended at a small X marked near a geological fault line. "The Lost Dutchman vein," Silas murmured. "It exists." "My father, he knew this whole time?" Ellie asked, feeling a surge of betrayal mixed with grief. "He let us live in poverty while he sat on a fortune. Fear," Silas said softly. He looked at her, his expression intense. "Gold makes men mad. He saw what it did to me. He wanted to protect you from the curse. The curse seems to have found me, anyway," Ellie said, folding the map and tucking it into her bodice. She looked around the farmhouse. It was a wreck. Windows, broken furniture, overturned bullet holes in the walls. It was no longer a home. It was a battlefield. "We can't stay here," she said. "Sterling will come back with more men. When Kruger wakes up and tells him we fought back, he won't send thugs. He'll bring an army." Silas nodded. "We go to the anvil. We find the proof. Then we go to the marshal in Casper." "Casper is 3 days' ride," Ellie said. "We have no horses. They burned the barn." Silas walked to the back door and whistled a low, piercing sound. From the darkness of the trees, a shadow emerged. It was Silas's black gelding, Midnight. The horse had bolted during the fire, but had stayed close, loyal to the only master it knew. Silas stroked the horse's nose, calming its trembling. He checked the saddlebags. A rifle, a canteen, a bedroll. Not enough for 2 people. But it would have to do. He mounted the horse, then reached down, extending his arm to Ellie. "Trust me." Ellie looked at the hand. It was rough-scarred and stained with blood. It was the hand of a killer. But looking up into his face, she saw the eyes of the man who had sat on the ridge for weeks, guarding her while she slept. "With my life," she said. She took his hand. He swung her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against the rough canvas of his duster. He smelled of smoke, sweat, and rain. As they rode out of the yard, Ellie looked back one last time. Kruger was stirring on the porch. The embers of the barn glowed like angry eyes. She wasn't leaving her home behind. She was riding toward her fate. The Badlands were a furnace. By noon the next day, the sun was a physical weight, hammering down on the rocks until the air shimmered with heat haze. They moved slowly. Midnight was a strong horse, but carrying 2 riders through the vertical terrain of the granite mountains was grueling. Silas kept them off the main trails, sticking to the rocky scree where their tracks would be harder to follow. They didn't speak much. The heat made conversation difficult, and the constant threat of pursuit made silence a necessity. But the physical proximity was a conversation of its own. Ellie could feel the tension in Silas's back every time a hawk screeched or a rock tumbled. She felt the way he shifted his weight to shield her from the worst of the sun. They stopped at a small spring hidden in a cluster of boulders. Silas dismounted first, his legs stiff. He helped Ellie down. Her legs almost gave way, but he caught her holding her steady for a long moment. "Drink," he said, handing her the canteen. She took a sip, then tried to hand it back. He shook his head. "More." "You haven't had any," she argued. "I am Camel," he said, the ghost of a smile touching his eyes. "You are Flower." Ellie laughed, a dry, cracking sound. "I think I'm more of a tumbleweed at this point, Silas." He took the canteen, then taking a small, disciplined sip before capping it. He walked to the edge of the rocks, scanning the horizon with a small brass telescope he pulled from his saddlebag. "Are they coming?" Ellie asked, joining him. Silas handed her the glass. "Look, 3 miles back. Dust." Ellie squinted through the lens. Sure enough, a plume of dust was rising against the blue sky. Riders, moving fast. "Sterling and Reed," Silas said, his voice darkening. "Reed." Ellie lowered the telescope. "The lawyer. He's riding with them." "Greed makes strange bedfellows," Silas spat. "Reed knows the law. Sterling knows the violence. Together. Dangerous." They mounted up again, pushing harder now. The terrain grew steeper. They were entering the Devil's Anvil. The rocks here were red and twisted, formed by ancient volcanic violence. The wind howled through the narrow slot canyons, creating a sound like whispering voices. "Turn back. Turn back." "The Indians call this the Canyon of Whispers," Silas said, guiding the horse over a treacherous shale slide. "They say the spirits of greedy men are trapped in the walls." "Let's hope there's room for a few more," Ellie said grimly. By late afternoon they reached the spot marked on the map. It was a box canyon, a dead end, surrounded by 300-foot vertical cliffs. At the base of the far wall, obscured by a thick growth of mesquite bush, was a dark opening. The mine. It wasn't a professional shaft. It was a natural fissure that had been widened with pickaxes. Timber supports, grey with age, framed the entrance. "Stay here," Silas commanded. He slid off the horse and drew his revolver. He approached the entrance cautiously. He lit a match, throwing it inside. The flame illuminated a tunnel that sloped sharply downward. "It's here," he said. Suddenly, a crack echoed through the canyon. Rock exploded near Silas's head, showering him with dust. Crack-thoom! The sound of a high-powered rifle rolling through the canyon. "Cover!" Silas roared, diving behind a boulder. Ellie scrambled off the horse, slapping Midnight on the rump, to send him running back down the trail, away from the line of fire. She threw herself behind a fallen log, just as a second bullet chewed up the wood inches from her face. "Pinned down!" Silas yelled. He peered over the rock, firing a shot blindly toward the canyon entrance. High above them on the rim of the canyon, silhouettes appeared. "Well, well," the voice boomed down, amplified by the acoustics of the canyon. It was Jedediah Sterling. "End of the line, Miss Grace, nowhere left to run." Ellie looked up. They were trapped. Sterling had the high ground. He had them in a bowl. "Give up the map, Ellie." Another voice, thin, reedy. Amos Reed. "Be reasonable. We can still make a deal." "Liar!" Ellie screamed back. "You'll kill us the moment you have it. Smart girl." Sterling laughed. "Boys, flush 'em out. Dynamite." Ellie saw a hand wind up on the cliff edge. A stick of dynamite fuse, sputtering, arced through the air. "Move!" Silas broke from his cover. He didn't run away. He ran toward Ellie. He tackled her just as the dynamite hit the ground 10 yards away. Boom! The world went white. The concussion wave slammed into them, knocking the wind out of Ellie. Dirt and rocks rained down. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine. She felt Silas's weight on top of her. He wasn't moving. "Silas!" she screamed, rolling him over. He was conscious but dazed. Blood trickled from his nose. He shook his head, trying to clear the cobwebs. "Inside," he groaned. "The mine. It's the only way." "It's a dead end," Ellie cried. "Better a hole than a grave," Silas said. He grabbed her hand, and they scrambled toward the dark mouth of the mine. Bullets kicked up dust around their heels. Another stick of dynamite landed near the entrance, but they dove inside just as it detonated. The explosion collapsed the timber supports at the entrance. With a terrifying rumble, the rocks above the entrance gave way. The daylight was blotted out. A wall of rubble crashed down, sealing them inside the mountain. Darkness. Absolute suffocating darkness. Ellie coughed the dust, choking her. "Silas! Silas, are you there?" A match flared. Silas was sitting against the wall, his face pale in the flickering light. He held the match up. They were in a small antechamber, perhaps 10 feet wide. Behind them, the entrance was blocked by tons of rock. Ahead of them, the tunnel descended into the black. "Trapped," Silas whispered. "We're alive," Ellie said, her voice shaking. She crawled over to him. "Are you hit?" "Just rattled," he said. He looked at the blocked entrance. "They can't get in. Not without digging for days." "And we can't get out," Ellie said. "Maybe," Silas said. He stood up, unsteady. He lit a kerosene lantern that had been left hanging on a hook by the previous miners. Miraculously, it still had oil. The yellow light pushed back the shadows. "Look!" Silas pointed. The walls of the tunnel were not just rock. They were streaked with veins of quartz. And running through the quartz, thick and buttery, was gold. It was everywhere. The walls glittered with it. It was the mother lode, a fortune beyond comprehension. But Silas wasn't looking at the gold. He was looking at the floor of the tunnel. There was a draft, a cool breeze coming from deeper inside. "Air," Silas said. Ellie realized what he meant. "If there's air moving, there's another way out." Silas nodded. He held out his hand to her again. In the dim lantern light, surrounded by millions of dollars in gold that they couldn't eat or drink. The only thing that mattered was the connection between their hands. "One way forward," Silas said. "Together," Ellie replied. They turned their backs on the blocked entrance and walked deeper into the dark, following the breeze into the heart of the mountain. The air in the tunnel grew thinner, but the draft grew stronger. Silas and Ellie moved through the dark, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows against walls that shimmered with enough gold to to buy the entire state of Wyoming. Yet neither of them stopped to chip a piece off. The weight of survival was heavier than any nugget. The tunnel narrowed into a vertical chimney, a volcanic vent that twisted upward toward a circle of faint grey light. "I go first," Silas whispered, tying the rope around his waist and handing the end to Ellie. "If I fall, I don't want to crush you." The climb was a nightmare of scraped skin and burning muscles. Silas wedged his back against one wall and his boots against the other, inching up the chimney. He reached the top, hauling himself onto a narrow limestone ledge that jutted out from the cliff face hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. He pulled Ellie up. She collapsed beside him, gasping for the sweet, cool air. They were covered in soot, their clothes torn, bleeding from a dozen small cuts. They looked down. Far below, at the blocked entrance of the mine, campfires flickered. Silas handed Ellie the telescope. She peered through it. The alliance of greed was crumbling. Amos Reed was pacing nervously, gesturing at the blocked cave. Jedediah Sterling was sitting on a rock, cleaning his gun, ignoring the lawyer. The hired guns looked bored and restless. "They think we're dead," Ellie whispered, "or dying." "Let them wait," Silas said. He looked at the horizon. "We walk." It was a 10-mile trek across the high mesa to the nearest mining outpost, South Pass City. They walked through the night, guided by the stars. Without water, without food, kept moving only by the adrenaline of the hunted and the quiet strength of the man beside her. Silas didn't let go of her hand. When they stumbled into the marshal's office in South Pass City, the next morning they looked like revenants rising from the grave. The U.S. Marshal, a no-nonsense man named Bass Reeves, a legendary lawman known for operating in the territory, listened to their story. When Ellie produced the map and a chunk of gold-flecked quartz she had picked up from the tunnel floor, Reeves stood up and racked his Winchester. "I've been looking for a reason to clip Sterling's wings," Reeves said. "Kidnapping, attempted murder, and blowing up a mountain. That'll do." 3 days later. The sun was high over the Grace homestead. Sterling had already moved his men into the farmhouse. He sat on Ellie's porch, his feet up on the railing, drinking Ellie's father's whiskey. "I told you, Amos," Sterling shouted to the lawyer inside. "They're buried. The farm is ours. The water is ours." "I don't like it, Jed," Reed's voice wavered. "We should have dug them out to confirm." "You worry too much." Sterling stopped. He squinted at the horizon. A line of riders was cresting the ridge, not hired guns. These men rode in formation. At the front, a white hat shone in the sun. "Federal Marshal," Kruger shouted, running from the barn. Sterling stood up, his hand dropping to his gun. "Hold your ground. This is my land." The riders thundered into the yard. Marshal Reeves pulled his horse up, dust swirling. Beside him rode Silas Thorne, looking cleaner, but no less dangerous, and Ellie Grace wearing a new dress and a look of cold fury. "Jedediah Sterling," Reeves's voice was like a thunderclap. "Step away from the weapon." "You have no authority here," Sterling roared. "This woman abandoned the property. I didn't abandon it," Ellie called out, her voice clear and strong. "I went to get the pest control." Sterling snarled and went for his gun. He never cleared leather. Silas was faster. He didn't kill him. He shot the revolver right out of Sterling's hand. The villain howled, clutching his shattered fingers, falling to his knees. Reed ran out onto the porch, waving a white handkerchief frantically. "I surrender. It was all him. I was coerced." As the deputies cuffed Sterling and his men, Ellie walked up the steps of her porch. She looked down at the man who had terrorized her father and tried to kill her. "The debt is paid, Mr. Sterling," she said icily. And the Double Bar Ranch, I think the court will seize that for damages. She turned to Silas. The silent cowboy was standing by the railing, watching the marshal take the men away. The crowd dispersed, leaving them alone in the quiet of the afternoon. The farm was battered. The barn was ash, but the land was still there. And under the mountain, the gold was waiting. Ellie walked over to Silas. She reached up and touched the scar on his cheek. "You can go now if you want," she said softly. "You're free. You don't have to be a ghost on the ridge anymore." Silas looked at her. He took her hand, pressing his lips to her palm. "I am not a ghost." He spoke, his voice raspy, but stronger than she had ever heard it. "I am home." He didn't need to say anything else. The dying farm wasn't dying anymore. It was just beginning. Eleanor Grace came west to inherit a farm, but she ended up inheriting a war. In the end, the gold wasn't the real treasure of Blackwood Creek. The gold was just metal cold and hard. The real fortune was the bond forged in the fire, the trust built between a woman who wouldn't quit and a man who thought he had nothing left to give. They say Silas and Ellie built the biggest ranch in Wyoming, not with the gold, which they donated to build the town's first school and hospital, but with cattle and hard work. They never fixed the scar on Silas's face, and Ellie never fixed the bullet holes in the parlor wall. They kept them as reminders. In the Wild West, survival isn't given, it's earned. What a ride, I want to know. If you were Ellie, would you have kept the gold for yourself or given it away like she did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice, romance, and grit, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story from the frontier. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.